All right, so let's pick up where we left off on Tuesday. And we're going to be starting out with sentencing models. Bit of a philosophical question. How should we, as a society, determine how much time someone should spend behind bars after committing an offense? A lot of what we discussed before was the philosophy behind punishing, but we didn't really talk too much about how much time someone should spend. Statutes in jurisdictions where crimes are committed, those are the things that are going to determine the penalties that a court may impose. Um, Firstly, let's discuss indeterminate sentences. Indeterminate sentences is a term of incarceration, or the time you're going to spend in prison and jail combined. Um, that has a stated minimum and maximum length. The prisoner would be eligible for parole after the minimum time served. Now, to be clear, this is based on the belief that sentences should fit the crime and that the treatment should fit the offender. It allows for individualized sentencing. The law may issue a minimum and maximum for a crime committed, but the judge is able to fix the sentence within that range. This type of sentencing allows for flexibility in the type of sentence imposed and the length of the time served. And that's really important because this allows the judge to have discretion. I know a lot we've spoken about officer discretion. We've spoken a little bit about prosecutorial discretion. Now we're talking about when the judges have some discretion and they get to pick whether they think it should lean harsh or they should lean lenient. All right, so if we just spoke about indeterminate sentences, now let's discuss determinate. Determinate sentence is a fixed term of incarceration or a set amount of time you have to spend behind bars. Many people consider determinate sentences to be too restrictive for rehabilitative like actions or purposes. Essentially, the idea that if your main goal is to fix the offender's behavior, or in other words, address the underlying issue in hopes that they don't offend anymore, not having flexibility is probably going to hinder that process. The advantage of a determinate sentence, though, or at least one of the advantages, would be that that the offender is actually going to know how much time they're going to serve. There's nothing up in the air, nothing left for interpretation. Now, regulating the length of sentences and curbing judicial discretion lead to the creation of these, let's say, harsher sentencing guidelines. Now, what are sentencing guidelines? They are a set of standards that define parameters for trial judges to follow in their sentencing decisions. These guidelines are going to include the severity of the crime and the offender's prior criminal history. All right, so I want to just take a brief moment to acknowledge that the United States criminal justice system can be complicated. It may be easier for people learning about the system if every state operated the same, but it does not. Some states use voluntary advisory sentencing guidelines, which are basically they just suggest rather than mandate the sentences, whereas other use presumptive sentencing guidelines, which require judges to use guidelines to shape decisions. So yeah, it can get complicated. With that being said, let's examine some Supreme Court cases that are relevant here. Firstly, in Blakely v. Washington, the Supreme Court found Washington state sentencing guidelines were a violation of the defendant's Sixth Amendment rights. The judge determined the offense involved deliberate cruelty, which must be determined by a jury, right? Just to be clear, when they're talking about that the judge determined the offense involved deliberate cruelty, what they're saying, I mean, the judge was saying that the offender was like basically, in lack of a better term, like a bad person, that they went out of their way to inflict cruelty. But that was the finding of a fact. And the finding of a fact is the job of the jury, not the job of the judge. Now, in the United States v. Booker, the court ruled that federal guidelines were unconstitutional. Judges should consider the guideline ranges, but must also be permitted to alter sentences in consideration of other facts. This is the idea of looking at mitigating versus aggravating circumstances. Now, before these Supreme Court cases, presumptive guidelines have been criticized as being rigid. And presumptive, we're talking about like you have to serve a certain amount. These are indeterminate. states were criticized for, I said being rigid, harsh, over complex, and even being disliked by some of the other judiciary. Now, state and federal courts are now addressing these issues and creating mechanisms for proper administration of guidelines. These issues and creating mechanisms for proper administration of these guidelines are, again, a step in the right direction. Now, though guidelines are now advisory, they're optional to follow rather than being mandatory, they still have a great deal of impact on sentencing decisions. So let's just dive a little bit further to look at, the weird idiosyncrasies of the U.S. justice system. All right, so let's discuss mandatory sentencing, which you should notice is going to fall either determinate or indeterminate sentencing. You try to guess which one it's going to fall under. Mandatory sentencing is a statutory requirement that a certain penalty be set and carried out in all cases upon conviction for a specific offense or series of offenses. In other words, if you do this crime, you will get this sentence. There's nothing else is going to save you because this is just what it is. This is the law. You do this crime, you're going to serve these many years. Deal with it. Now, an example of this that got widely publicized was California's controversial three strikes laws. A three strikes law is essentially, well, they were designed to impose longer sentences upon career and chronic violent offenders. You can take the analogy from like a baseball game, 3 strikes and you're out. Well, if you commit 3 different felony offenses, the idea is that you're supposed to progressively get sentenced to longer sentences, the 3rd strike being, you get sentenced harshly. Now, which was interesting, one, it had substantial public and political support because it made sense. You give them chances, they burn their chances, and then they get hit with the book. This actually, some people said, may have been the reason that the prison population increased so much because people were getting arrested for nonviolent felonies. Now, some evidence that offenders are held accountable for relatively minor but violent crimes that happened decades ago also increased the prison sizes. Now, the 3 strikes laws have been challenged on constitutional grounds. The Supreme Court upheld sentencing in Leonardo, Andre, and Gary Ewing, which was a case that said essentially it wasn't so grossly disproportionate as to violate the 8th Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, which is, it's their way of saying that they didn't see it as a violation of our constitutional rights to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, so they found nothing wrong with it. Is this widespread? Well, approximately half of all states in the United States have 3 strikes laws, okay? But this is an important qualifier. Nearly all of them require the 3rd felony to be a serious one in order to hit that 25-year mark. Or in other words, to get a very, very hard slap on the wrist. To get that 3rd felony, you get sentenced to 25 years. It has to be a serious felony. All right, let's take a look at imposing the sentence now. A judge's sentence is based on a variety of information that's going to be available to them, whatever they have on hand. So they can be victim impact statements. So essentially, these are statements after someone's found guilty, and they're determining how long to sentence them. This is, a victim, could be the victim or a family member or friend, someone who knew them, discussing the impact of that crime on their life, maybe, or just in the world in general. Or, the judge may look at investigative reports made by the probation office. So with that being said, let's look at the ways in which people can serve once they get sentenced, concurrently and consecutively. Firstly, concurrently, which means an offender with convictions for multiple offenses, which means that they were found guilty of more than one crime. They may be allowed to serve the sentences for each of these offenses simultaneously. So let me give you an example. If a burglar was convicted of 3 burglaries and got 5 years for each offense, this person would only serve 5 years in prison. Even though they got convicted on 3 counts, they're serving it concurrently, which means instead of serving 15 years, because 3 separate counts, found guilty of all 3, 5 years, 3 times 5 is 15. The person's only serving 5 because they're serving their sentence for each count all at the same time. Now, if concurrently means at the same time, consecutively means one after the other. So an offender with convictions for multiple offenses is required to serve each sentence one after the other. So, for example, if a burglar was convicted of 3 burglaries and got 5 years for each offense, that person would serve 15 years in prison. And we should not forget about the effect of good time, which states that if an inmate follows the prison rules, then this person may accrue days that reduce their prison sentence. All right, and this is a visual aid to explore the differences between consecutive and concurrent sentencing. I highly recommend you pause the video right here, take a look if need be, read over it to make sure that you understand the differences. There, might be a question on a quiz about it. All right, so let's examine some broad facts relating to sentencing in America. Firstly, more than 1 million adults are convicted of felonies each year. 70% of felonies convicted in state courts are sentenced to a period of confinement, which means that 7 out of the 10 times when you are convicted of a felony, you're going to be sentenced to some jail time. Well, actually, since it's a felony, it'll be prison time. Now, of those sentenced to confinement, right, behind bars, 40% of state prison and 30% go to local jails. So of that, that whole pie, so let's say you're just dealing with 10 people, even though you're not, but for sake of simplicity, so you're dealing with 10 people, 3 of them are not going to be sentenced to any confinement at all. 7 of them will be. And out of that 7, 4 of them are going to go to state prison and 3 of them are going to go to local jails. The remaining 30%, those people who avoided spending any time behind bars, they're probably going to be sentenced straight to probation. Now, felonies sentenced in state prisons had an average sentence of 4.5 years. But people sentenced that were likely to serve only about half of that. About 1/3 of all sentenced offenders are typically expected to pay a fine, pay victim restitution, which means you pay damages to the victim. At the very least, you try to replace what you broke or stole. They receive treatment, the victims, not the victims, the offender receives treatment, they perform community service, or they comply with some other additional penalty. Now, violent offenders give prison sentences, violent offenders are given prison sentences, an average of roughly 8 years. Property offenders typically sentenced to about 4. And lastly, the number of convicted offenders being sent to prison is lower than a decade ago due to increasing popularity of cost-effective community sentencing. This table shows the average and median length for felony defendants. Now remember the mean is the average, whereas the median is the number closest to the middle. So you'll see how most of the numbers are similar, but slightly different, and sometimes pretty meaningfully different. So whenever you're taking your stat class, just, make note of that. Pause it if you need be, take a look. This is the same table, just continued. So same thing, pause it if need be, examine it and see what seems out of whack to you. All right, so now I want you to take a few moments. Let's say that you were tasked with designing the penal code, right? Someone said, hey, I want you to identify what factors should influence how long someone should be sentenced. And this is a real job. We actually still tinker with these penal codes now. I think I mentioned before, half of the states have 3 strikes laws, half of them don't. And they're like that for a reason. It's because, in a way, the criminal justice system is kind of like one big playground. Well, let's not call it a playground. Let's put it this way. The states, each individual state's kind of doing their own thing, and then hopefully states see what's working and then they copy. That's the way that the United States would work ideally, right? So let's say someone gave you a turn at the wheel and said, what kind of factors would you highlight that should be the most important factors to determine how long someone should be sentenced? Based on research, right, thus far, we have found strong legal correlations between these factors I've listed below and the length of a sentence. The first one, which should be the most obvious one, hopefully you came up with this one first, The severity of the offense, right? What did you do? Did you steal something from a store? Did you murder someone? Next, the offender's prior criminal record. Is this person offending repeatedly? If they are, we may want to consider removing them from the pool of potential, removing them from society or incapacitating them just for the sake of not giving them the ability to commit more crime. Maybe while they're in their place, they can be rehabilitated, see the error in their way. Or possibly this person, when they get arrested for stealing so much, they can pay restitution, pay their just deserts, right? Maybe even get punished for the crime, a little bit of retribution there. Several different ways in which we can try to argue about what could be done. But needless to say, prior record's important. Did the offender use violence? Did the offender use weapons? Whether the crime was committed for money? These are all things that people tend to consider when they are sentencing, with particular the violence and the weapon. Um, for obvious reasons, you want to disincentivize someone trying to, do anything basically with the firearm. So anyway, judges sentence more severe in cases involving the most serious criminal charges. People with prior felony convictions are much more likely to receive prison time than those convicted of misdemeanors. Now, keep in mind that they may not also consider these things because they're not legally allowed to consider them, like things like mental capacity and age, right? They're not really considering these, and you should understand why. They're not considering age because if you're in the criminal court, you are over the age of 18. You're deemed an adult, or in some states you can be deemed an adult, earlier than 18, but we use 18 as that number. So they're not considering age. Next, they're also not going to be considering your mental capacity because if you're not fit for trial, you have to prove that. But they're not going to be considering that during sentencing because if you're already found guilty, then that ship has already sailed. I think I'm going to cut that there, but I want you all to really consider what factors should be the most important. Maybe there's something that you thought of that was left off this list. I'd like to hear about it. All right, so let's examine this figure for type of sentence received for a felony conviction in the 75 largest counties in 2009. Examine the chart on the top. The chart is displaying how prior record influenced how people convicted of violent felonies were sentenced. Now, although most people received prison time no matter what their prior record was, there was a direct correlation between prior record and the severity of sentence. Stated differently, if you had a prior record, you're more likely to receive prison. Furthermore, the likelihood of receiving a prison sentence increased if you had a prior felony, and then if you had multiple prior felonies, your likelihood of receiving prison increased even further. And we see that trend for violent felonies on the top and the non-violent felonies on the bottom. Put differently, if you have experience in the criminal justice system and you are the defendant and you've been convicted at least once, your likelihood of receiving prison if you go up and get arrested again is higher. Now, this world, it's not perfect, or I guess I should say this criminal justice system is not perfect. There are some extra legal factors that influence how someone can be sentenced. Now, the text it defines extra legal factors as demographic factors that are associated with criminal sanctions. In other words, things unrelated to the criminal offense that was committed that influence how long you are sentenced. Consideration of such variables, right, would be a direct violation of the constitutional due process and equal protection, as well as federal statutes. So things that shouldn't be considered, but they are. One, social class. Typically, lower social class offenders tend to receive harsher sentences. Education. Education may play a role in whether a sentence is imposed, but not necessarily on the length of a sentence. Gender. Male offenders tend to receive harsher sentences than female offenders, even for the same offense. This may be explained by the chivalry hypothesis, the idea that men tend to defer, try to perceive themselves as the caretakers and the protector of women. But anyway, mandatory and structured sentences have resulted in actually harsher sentences for women because why? They're taking discretion out of it. Which I should also, again, just go over the chivalry hypothesis because I don't think I touched on that yet. It's the view that the lower rates of female delinquency are a reflection of the leniency in which police and judges treat female offenders with, because they have a paternalistic or protective attitude towards women. Now, next, age. Older offenders sometimes receive harsher sentences because they have a greater opportunity to accumulate a criminal record. In other words, they've been around the block longer, they probably have prior felonies, thus you get more likely to get sentenced. You're more likely to be sentenced to prison, as we just discussed on the previous slide. Other times, judges show a leniency because they think elderly people pose little risk to society. Next, race. It's a pervasive feature of sentencing, which is that racial and ethnic minority offenders tend to receive harsher sentences. This is especially true when the victims are white. Victim characteristics. Sentencing may be reduced when victims have a negative personal characteristic or quality. And lastly, victim impact statement. A post-conviction statement by a victim a victim, as I said, a friend of a crime that may be used to guide the judge in their sentencing. Okay, so let's discuss capital punishment, which, if we haven't already covered, which I believe we've spoken about a few times, is the death penalty. Approximately 15,000 confirmed executions have been carried out under civil authority since 1608. Okay, 15,000. I don't know if that number seems big or small to you, but that's how many people we've put to death. In recent years, it has been limited to just first-degree murders with aggravating circumstances. First-degree murder is a murder that is a premeditated murder. It is something that you planned deliberately with a clear mind. Okay, maybe not necessarily clear because we don't know your mental state, but the idea is that you made preparation to commit this murder versus you killing someone in the heat of the moment. That's a crime of passion. It's not first-degree murder. People who won't, typically, if you're only put to death is when you premeditate it and there's other aggravating circumstances. So in other words, things that would make you think that that person is not a good person. And I will say, no issue basically in the criminal justice system with regards to sentencing is more controversial or emotional than this. What are some other facts? Since 1990, 45 countries have actually abolished the death penalty. Research by, I want to say Samuel Gross, estimates that about 1 in 25 death row inmates is actually innocent. And lastly, today, about 42% of inmates on death row are African American. Okay. All right, so here is a visual representation of the number of executions in the United States by year since 1976. All right, so let's hear some arguments for and against capital punishment, and see if these arguments coincide with what you actually believe, what you thought of when you thought of the death penalty. Firstly, we talk about deterrence. Execution does, in fact, it does deter people from committing murder. At least one person. It deters the person you're killing because they don't have the ability to kill anymore because they're dead. Does this deter people who are not the ones being killed? That's left up for debate. It's a heated debate. We discussed that in order for deterrence to be effective, there needs to be a high degree of certainty. It needs to be carried out swiftly. The punishment I'm talking about. So death penalty cases are not carried out swiftly. They take a very long time to actually go through, which is largely due to the appeal process. The appeals make it last forever if someone's on death row. But that being said, that is one argument for it. It deters crime. Moral, right? There's a moral foundation in books that are very important to this country, like the Bible and other religious works. Proponents argue that execution provides the victim with justice, right? There's also the idea that it is proportional to the crime. Putting a person to death for killing another person seems proportionate to the crime they committed, that's their just desserts. It reflects public opinion. The death penalty has strong public support. Shockingly, it still does. Public approval rates on the belief that the death penalty is an important instrument of social control can deter crime and is less costly than maintaining a murderer in prison for life. They say, why am I going to spend tax dollars on someone who's never going to get out? And lastly, unlikely chance of error. Given the automatic appeal process and extensive post-conviction work, it is very unlikely that an innocent person will be executed. I know some people obviously have a problem with saying one person is too many, and I agree that one person is too many. Now, the number I gave you before by one researcher was the highest number that I've ever seen was 1 out of 25 by Samuel. I think his name's Samuel Grossman. But anyway, 1 out of 25 is 4%. So he estimates that about 4% people on death row are innocent. Doesn't mean that they're going to get executed. It means they're scheduled to get executed. But yeah, so consider that the next time someone talks about the death penalty. Okay, so last slide I spoke about arguments for it. Now I'm going to speak about some arguments against the death penalty. One, there is the possibility of an error. As I said, although it's rare, an innocent person probably has been executed before, and the chance is still there. The Innocence Movement, you may actually have heard of things like the Innocence Project, is designed to investigate crimes, to identify, exonerate innocent people on death row, largely fueled by the use of DNA, which was not available when these people were convicted. Let's talk about public support. Even though the text does reference that public support was strong for the death penalty, in recent years, public support has actually decreased a little bit. And if a given choice of punishment, support usually wanes even more. In other words, when people are actually given a choice, their support levels are actually lower than if you just polled them normally and said, do you support the death penalty or not? When they're actually being offered it, they're less likely to pick it. Furthermore, people who actually support the death penalty generally may not want to see it used with juveniles, the mentally challenged, the mentally ill. So they have restrictions on who they want it used on. Little or no deterrent effect. There are some people who believe that the death penalty, based on research, which is actually rather strong, it says that the threat of capital punishment has little effect on murder rates. People, again, always they have this fallacy that they're either not going to get caught or they just don't care. So, which both of them renders this of little deterrent effect. Next, race, gender, and other biased issues. The research suggests that offenders from minority groups are more likely to receive the death penalty. Remember, over 40% of people on death row are African American. This is especially true if the victim is not a member of a minority group. So if the victim's white. Men overwhelmingly receive the death penalty compared to women. It's really, really rare for a woman to receive the death penalty, and even rarer for them to be executed. Some people say it causes more crime than it deters. I think they might be leaning into the brutalization effect, but anyway, some experts believe that the possibility of a death sentence may make an offender actually more violent and more likely to assault the police trying to apprehend them, because this is if you look at it from a theoretical perspective, some experts believe that the death penalty produces a brutalization effect, which is an increase in violence because execution rates, I mean, if you give someone, well, you can't give someone, but if execution rates go up, right, if they rise, the general level of violence is going to follow. And some people think that it's, cruel and humane. Death by lethal injection is thought by some people to cause extreme pain and take much longer to cause death than it's actually originally believed, which is actually true. They switch around drugs. Not every prison uses the same one. What else? Let me see. The process that inmates go through prior to execution also, by the way, is extremely psychologically damaging. I mean, really knowing when your time is up is probably not the best for most people. Most developed countries, as we already said, have already abandoned it. More than half of the countries in the world has actually abandoned the death penalty. 145 of them alone since was it 1995? I believe I said. Since 1990, yeah, since 1995. Even countries not known for their civil liberties, like China, have actually moved away from capital punishment for certain crimes. Although again, I've paused to give them credit because they also have known to harvest organs from people on death row. So what else? It's expensive. Some research suggests that it costs more to execute a person because of legal appeals, litigation, security, than to just keep them in prison until they, die of natural causes. And lastly, some people think it's morally wrong. Some people believe the death penalty is brutal and demeaning. Some religions believe that it violates important theoretical teachings. Franklin Zimmering argues that America's unique culture, so in other words, like vigilantes in the Old West, is the cause for our obsession with the death penalty. Like someone gets what they deserve. But either way, these are some pretty solid arguments against the death penalty. All right, so let's look at some Supreme Court cases regarding the death penalty that are worth discussing. Firstly, in Furman v. Georgia, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the discretionary imposition of the death penalty is cruel and unusual under the Eighth and 14th Amendments. In particular, they didn't really have a problem with the death penalty. They just felt like it shouldn't be applied or imposed in an arbitrary and capricious manner. What does that mean exactly? Well, in essence, it means that you can't just discretionarily apply the death penalty. It's why we have a whole process now. You have a jury, people that need to be selected for the death, to actually give out the death penalty. You have to be asked before, when you're on a jury that the capital punishment is up in the air, you have to be asked, can you impose a death penalty if it comes up? If you say no, you cannot be on that jury. It's very different than having a judge just decide it. Let's also look at Gregg v. Georgia, which again is in the 1970s, 1976, which ruled again on the constitutionality of the death penalty. But this was like basically a summary ruling for several different cases that all tried to address the same problem. They just picked this case to be the name of it. It allowed the imposition of the death penalty if one, or basically one of many, so at least one, aggravating issues were proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The ruling in this case led these, basically it signaled to the country the return of capital punishment as a sentencing option. The court made rulings that placed significant limitations on the use of the death penalty, though. For example, in Ring v. Arizona, the court found that juries, not judges, must make the critical findings that send convicted killers to death row, which is why I just discussed about having a jury that is a death qualified jury. And the court has made other legal restrictions, which we're going to look at right now. Here's a list of some of the most important Supreme Court cases regarding capital punishment in the United States. I highly suggest you pause it, just take a read, basically describes what was the result of each one of these cases in one sentence. And that is it. We have a quiz, which considering the date that I'm going to be publishing this, I'm going to give you all until probably next Thursday to complete the quiz, which is on this chapter. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.